idea rather popular and indeed consistent with the founding values on which our nation was built. The group that doesn't like it so much is the group that's currently in charge. They want to conserve or keep the status quo, thereby keeping things just the way they are. Those two contrasting viewpoints could even be seen in the relationship that England had with the 13 North American colonies. Indeed, this was a master-servant relationship where England had the unilateral right to make all the important decisions about the political and economic life of everything that happened in the colonies. At one point in time, when enough colonials judged English rule to be demeaning to both colonial dignity and the way of life in the colonies united as one and fought the American Revolution to end English tyranny, and establish the democratic republic we know as the United States of America. Now, when I was in school, I learned that our brand of representational democracy was not only the first, but also the best form of self-government on the planet. Our democracy was considered good and just because those who were being governed, well, most of those who were being governed, periodically got to elect representatives at all levels of government. President Lincoln's Gettysburg Address reminds us that ours was a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. What is not taught in school, but is worthwhile examining, is just who, at the time of our nation's founding, actually had that civic right to cast votes in local, state, and federal elections, the right to elect their governmental representatives. For the most part, the right, of course, was limited by states, and it was limited to white property-owning males. Not surprisingly, who elected white property-owning males to office, who in turn had a habit of appointing white property-owning males to the bench. Depending upon who you read, that means that approximately somewhere between 10 and 25% of we the people got the right to determine who were the elected officials that governed everyone else in the country. Let's be clear. Expanding the right to vote and extending it to white male property owners was indeed a grand expansion of rights beyond what was available under English rule, but it is a far, far cry from the kind of civic and civil rights that we have in the United States today. The distinction between those without and with power, the power to vote at this point in time, is the cause of one of the first court cases dealing with organized labor in this country. A court case that pitted employees who were without the right to vote against employers who, coincidentally, did have the right to vote. This court case took place in Philadelphia in 1806 when a group of bootmakers formed a union and wanted to negotiate with their employers the same wages that unionized bootmakers were already earning in Baltimore and New York in an attempt to take wages out of competition. When the employers refused the union requests for increased wages and standards that you could find in Baltimore and New York, the union went out on strike. The long and the short of it was their employers sued the union both for striking and, in fact, for being a union in the first place. The trial was held in the Philadelphia Mayor's Court. 9 of the 12 jurors were employers, 3 of them were journeyman employees. The mayor/judge in this case looked and found no statutory law that had indeed been violated. No law had been enacted by the city of Philadelphia, the legislature of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, or the U.S. Congress that covered unions and collective bargaining. The court found the union leaders guilty anyway, but they found them guilty of violating common law, or, in a derogatory term, something that might be known as judge-made law. Now, this bit of common law had been indeed adapted from earlier English law that allowed one employee to ask his employer for a wage increase, but when 2 or more employees combined to raise their wages, the common law determined that they had formed an illegal criminal conspiracy to raise wages. By forcing an employer to raise wages, they had indeed committed a harm against the community. That trial certainly slowed down the idea of introducing the concept of democracy into the workplace. Over time, as our nation's growing economy became more industrial, the right to vote slowly on a state-by-state basis was expanded to white males who had no property. Again, not what we have today, but a large expansion from what was there before. And as a result, limited experiments in industrial democracy were attempted by employees. More and more employees who are tired of being treated by their employers as nothing more than costs to be controlled organized what I refer to as collective self-help organizations that today are known as labor unions. They created these labor unions in order to humanize the employer-employee relationship. Now, most of you don't know this history, and it's not an accident. It's not unusual. You would not know it if you were in Michigan, my home state. That's because it's not taught in the school system. Our nation's public schools exist for many reasons, but two of the primary ones are to prepare students to intelligently fulfill their responsibilities as citizens in our democratic republic and to find a way to earn enough money to take care of themselves and their families. The uniquely American story of how the employer-employee relationship evolved from its roots in the master-servant and master-slave relationship is not taught in our schools, which is a shame because indeed 92% of all the students will eventually become employees. They should be taught the history of how the employer-employee relationship was humanized and who humanized it. The story is at the nexus of both the school's preparation for students to participate in the democracy and in the economy. Future students and indeed future employers should know why Americans are no longer working 10 to 14-hour days and no longer working 6- and 7-day work weeks. What should we know? We should know who fought to humanize this relationship. Who is fighting to preserve the status quo? What were the arguments that finally moved us to pass the 40-hour work week? What were the arguments being used against moving and making those changes? Who fought to regulate child labor? Who fought against the regulation of child labor? All those sorts of basic concepts should be taught in school. A lot of students think school's not relevant. I think this could probably help them figure out that it is, at least on occasion. I believe this history would be relevant and enlightening. It's not being taught, and it should be. When it comes to learning how to protect yourself on the job from arbitrary, capricious, and discriminatory decisions by employers, on-the-job training is not enough. One final note about May Day, and I just go back a little further in history than 1886. May Day is actually our nation's second Labor Day. The first day that American organized labor took as its own was the 4th of July. It was our nation's Independence Day that those who sold their intelligence, their experience, and their strength in order to earn a living took for their own. It's not unusual because this country loves democracy. It is one of the first things that we teach our children in our public schools. Indeed, democracy is encapsulated in our Pledge of Allegiance. We love it so much in this country that we have a history of exporting it to other countries with guns if necessary. There's only one place in America that doesn't like democracy, and American society doesn't like democracy, and that's in the workplace. Labor unions exist to introduce limited amounts of democracy into that workplace. But when it comes to labor unions, employers don't like them or want them. They don't want that kind of democracy. The idea of permitting employees to have a collective voice in determining wages, hours, and other terms and conditions of employment is fought both by employers and their allies in government. The Philadelphia Working Men's Association of the 1830s celebrated Labor Day on the 4th of July. This workers' association viewed organized labor's push to establish democracy in the workplace as its patriotic duty. Here's a quote from that organization wrapping organized labor in the American flag. Quote, "The objects we have in view are hallowed by the sympathy of patriotism. It is to finish the glorious work of the revolution," end quote. In my mind, I'd say that the same hallowed work